So, how does your association get to the place where the money you put into your reserves each month is actually enough to offset ongoing deterioration? Well, there are 4 factors: your association's physical makeup, your starting reserve balance, the amount of cash margin desired to deal with the inevitable surprises, and the mathematical tool used to calculate reserve funding. In this portion of our webinar, Brian Weaver answers which 2 of these 4 factors you have control over, and he reveals how the results all come together for your association's unique reserve funding recommendation. So Brian, we're going to turn the microphone over to you. What affects the size of our reserve funding recommendations?
Thanks, Robert. Glad to be here with you and our audience today. We're here to talk about how much is required to fund reserves at your association. The amount may seem like a lot, but roofing is expensive, asphalt is expensive, elevators are expensive. Really, the key to minimizing your reserve funding needs is to spread them out nice and thin over time. There are 4 factors affecting the size of your reserve funding recommendation. First is the components, the physical assets you're responsible for maintaining. Some associations have more, some have less. This is custom to each association. If you missed it, we did actually discuss reserve components in detail in our Reserve Studies 101 webinar. That webinar is available on our website and YouTube. Second is your starting point, the size of your reserve fund. At this time, is your reserve fund strong? Is it fair? Or is it weak? Basically, are you in a good position just keeping up with ongoing deterioration, or are you starting way behind, having a lot of catch-up work to do in order to prepare for upcoming expenses? We cover reserve fund strength and how it's calculated in our Reserve Studies 102 webinar. Again, if you missed it, you can find it on our website or YouTube. Third is how much margin for the unexpected is right for your association. Basically, this amounts to how much you actually hate special assessments at your association and how much of a cash cushion you want to maintain. And fourth is the mathematical calculation tool used for crafting the funding plan. There are 2, the component method and the cash flow method. And making a wise choice is very important. I'll spend most of my time today on numbers 3 and 4 because those are the only ones where you have choices to make. You're stuck with the components you have at your association and with the reserve fund strength left to you by prior boards. But you do have choices when it comes to numbers 3 and 4. I want to talk briefly about reserve components. The first on my list. You may have a pool, roof, asphalt, or other components. Or you may not. Your association has a list of reserve components the association is responsible to maintain. As a board or manager, they are your common area repair and replacement responsibility. If you ignore them, owners get dissatisfied and you increase your liability exposure. Besides, curb appeal is real. Caring for the common elements also maximizes home values. In comparison, the cost of reserve funding will look small. And just like with components, I'll briefly address the effect of your starting reserve fund strength. Reserve fund strength is your starting point. So today is Wednesday. If you need to drive to New York City by the end of the week, the Red Star, it would be nice to start somewhere close, like the Blue Dot in Boston. It's a bit more of a challenge if you're starting from somewhere a bit farther away, like Myrtle Beach. Now you realize the farther away you are, the more you have to plan ahead. Getting to New York City is going to be a bigger challenge if you're starting in Dallas or even farther away in Los Angeles. Remember, your reserve components are all deteriorating and your roof is going to fail. It's in your best interest to be financially prepared, close to having enough funds. If you are starting out from far behind, or in this case of the map, a long way off, it means you're going to have to hustle to build your reserve fund in time to have the cash to perform your upcoming projects. So now we can talk about things where you have some control and ability to affect the results. Typically, your reserve study professional will have a recommendation for your association about how much margin is appropriate because things rarely happen exactly according to the plan. Here, I'm showing a set of reserve expenses scattered through the years. You want a funding plan that will provide enough cash for these expenses, like this blue line, always a little more than the expenses. This will allow you to do your reserve projects on schedule. But because nothing ever happens exactly according to the plan, it is a good idea to have a little margin in your plan, like this green line. The majority of your reserve funding goes straight to the expenses, but a little margin can go a long way to making life smoother at your association. So, how much margin is good? Let me show you what it looks like to have no margin. This chart shows an association pursuing baseline funding, a plan where at some future point in time, your reserve balance will fall close to zero, just barely cash positive. They technically have enough cash to do all their projects, but they have one or more pinch point years where reserve cash is near zero. And that's when the association risks a special assessment if things don't go exactly according to the plan. Fortunately, National Reserve Study Standards define 3 funding goals: baseline, which is what I just showed you; threshold, which is a chosen dollar or percent funded amount that you want to stay above; or full funding, which means the goal of having cash on hand equivalent to your amount of deterioration. Here's what it means to your association. When you are baseline funding your association, your reserve fund will approach zero cash or 0% funded for a few years surrounding your pinch point. That's the red zone on the left of this chart. In those years, statistically speaking, you have around a 50% chance of needing a special assessment because of insufficient cash on hand. Let's say you chose a threshold value of a dollar amount or its equivalent as a percent funded amount. Let's choose 50% funded just to illustrate. That's the yellow range in the middle of this chart. Staying above 50% funded means you'll have a high risk of special assessment down around 10%. That's pretty good. Having the additional margin in your reserve fund, a little bit more cash on hand, has significantly dropped your risk of a special assessment. And then there's full funding, our normal recommendation at association reserves. That's the green zone on the right. Not only is it an easily defensible goal because your reserve fund is the same size as the dollar value of what's deteriorated at your association, it also means your special assessment risk is close to zero. That means associations pursuing a full funding goal can basically avoid special assessments. And the good thing is that your margin choices aren't a big deal when it comes to the size of your reserve funding recommendations. Looking at our clients, the difference in reserve funding between what it takes to pursue just baseline funding and full funding is about 10 to 20%. Not a big difference in the size of your reserve transfers. Remember, most of your reserve cash gets spent on reserve projects, and there's a real benefit. Dropping the risk of special assessments from about 50% when you're near the pinch year to almost zero. That's peace of mind for your homeowners. And that brings us to the last topic, the method used to calculate the funding requirements. Like before, we're presuming the component expenses are set. This is just a discussion about the method used to calculate reserve funding needs. With reserves, the choice of the mathematical tool makes a big difference in the results. Typically, this choice is made by a reserve study professional, selecting what's best for your association. And for most associations, without specific legislation dictating otherwise, the choice is clear. Between the component method, also called straight line, and the cash flow method, also called pooled, the cash flow method is the clear winner. Very simply, it is more flexible and more advantageous to the association. The funding profile over the years can be crafted to maximize smoothness and fairness to the owners. And it is also easily adjusted to provide more or less funding margin, as I spoke about a few moments ago. So why would anyone use the component method? This topic is significant primarily to associations where state law points associations in this direction. This is also significant for individuals building their own reserve funding plans on a spreadsheet, Because the component method is very simple. Just do a calculation for each component one at a time. That's the key. And sum it at the bottom of the list. So the component method is kind of an up and down way to calculate your reserve funding requirements. I'll explain it this way. Let's take the second component from the list, pool resurfacing, a $10,000 project that needs to be done every 10 years. With that in mind, when the pool is new and without complicating this illustration with interest or inflation, you have 10 years to collect $10,000. So your reserve funding requirements are $10,000 divided by 10 years or $1,000 a year. It's pretty simple. If the association doesn't make all its budgeted reserve transfers and gets to the 5-year-old point and only has $2,500 set aside instead of $5,000, then the association has 5 years to fund the remaining $7,500 needed to prepare for this $10,000 expense. That's $7,500 over 5 years. So now the reserve funding needs for this component are $1,500 a year. In other words, getting a little behind on reserve funding has made the reserve funding requirement for the remaining years 50% higher. They're clearly in catch-up mode. Now let's let the association get a few more years down the road, and let's say they're way behind on the reserve funding. Remember talking about the importance of your starting point a few minutes ago. This means that they don't have much time, but they're financially far away from being prepared. On a side note, this is the state of most associations, unfortunately. So let's say they're at the 8-year-old point with only $6,000 set aside. That means they need to collect the remaining $4,000 in the last 2 years, or $2,000 a year. Their reserve funding needs calculate to be twice what they would have needed to collect if they'd been setting aside reserves responsibly through the years. But let's say they are able to collect the necessary funds so the project gets done. Then their cycle is reset all over again, and they're back to having 10 years to collect the next $10,000 to replace it again. That, of course, means the reserve funding needs for this component drop back down to $1,000 a year again. This is an opportunity for the board to enjoy learning from their reserve funding requirements. This little example illustrates the problems with the component method of funding, where boards find that if they get behind, the funding requirement begins to climb pretty steeply, but it drops down again right after the expense when you have a useful life cycle to prepare for the next project. Funding plans calculated with the component method, remember, many people call it the straight line method, where each component's reserve funding requirement is calculated separately, tend to be high in the first few years, dropping as a project gets accomplished. Remember this chart from a few minutes ago where I talked about looking at expenses and the value of some margin? This is what happens in the cash flow method. Expenses are projected throughout the years without consideration for what each year's reserve expenses are made up of, whether it's roofing, painting, asphalt, elevators, carpets, or whatever. Just expenses. Then you develop a smooth, multi-year funding plan looking at expenses projected out over the years, left to right, that provides sufficient margin pursuing the chosen goal. So while the component method is up and down, the cash flow method deals with exactly the same expenses, just looking at them right to left. From left to right. And when you do that, you can create a funding plan that is smooth over the years, gradually floating upwards with inflation. If you remember the 4 funding principles Robert showed at the beginning, this type of funding plan very nicely meets the equitable distribution funding principle. This is possible because with the cash flow method, each individual component does not need to be funded separately from the others. Your focus is on an annual cash need, not individual component needs. In the cash flow method, all expenses share one reserve fund, so there's never a rush in the last few years of a component's life. Reserve income and reserve expenses are smoothly balanced through the years because all the reserve funding goes into the pool, and all the expenditures come out from that same pool. There's no rushing. There's total sharing. This means funds can be used more efficiently than being divided up in all those separate different accounts, one for each component. So when I show them side by side, it's pretty clear. The same net funds go to reserves over the years. It's just that the cash flow method doesn't force associations to pay a steep price in the first few years to rapidly resolve any underfunding. So in either method, the same total amount goes into the reserves, but the cash flow method is and will always be a more efficient use of an association's reserves and will always be more favorable to the vast majority of associations in the country that find themselves at least somewhat underfunded. The cash flow method makes life in an underfunded association so much more palatable. What's important to note is that the initial year funding requirements calculated with the component method are regularly about twice as much as funding requirements calculated by the cash flow method. That's why we so clearly state that it's best to avoid the component method. Reserve professionals across the country avoid it. So if you're calculating your own reserve funding requirements by the component method, where each component's reserve needs are funded individually, please stop. Hire a reserve study professional and let them create a smoother funding profile for your association using cash flow methodology that doesn't punish your homeowner so severely in the first few years of the plan.
At Association Reserves, we make the present less stressful and the future more secure. If you want to join us in this mission, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Leave a comment down below on what you'd like to see us address in a future video. Let's plan for your best future.